My parents demanded I hand over the $250,000 scholarship I had spent 4 years bleeding for. They stood in a cold mahogany conference room in downtown Boston, sliding a blue bank transfer form across the polished wood, insisting the money belonged to the family. My mother actually smiled a brittle painted smile and told me it was my duty to save them. They planned to spend every cent bailing out my older sister. They did not notice my grandfather's lawyer sitting quietly at the head of the table. They did not know the money was locked inside a trust so rigid it would rather burn the funds than let them touch a single dollar. In a matter of minutes, their entitlement hit a legal brick wall. Welcome back to the channel. Grab your coffee, because the people in this story had every chance to be decent, and they failed spectacularly. Drop a comment and subscribe. You are going to love this one. Most people believe family is a safety net. They are wrong. Family is often just a ledger where the debts are always yours and the credits belong to someone else. My name is Lillian Russell, and I grew up in a quiet Massachusetts suburb where my parents measured love in dollar signs. They had 2 daughters, but if you looked at their bank statements, you would think they only had one. My older sister Beatrice was their golden investment. She received designer clothes, private tutors, and endless praise. I received hand-me-downs and lectures about fiscal responsibility. I was 17 when the final illusion broke. We were sitting in the dining room under a crystal chandelier my mother spent a month polishing. College acceptance letters sat on the oak table. Beatrice got into a luxury private college in Boston. I was accepted into a rigorous biochemistry program across the state. Beatrice sat across from me texting on a brand new phone, wearing a cashmere sweater our mother bought her for passing high school biology. I was wearing a faded cotton shirt from a thrift store bin. My father, Thomas, poured himself a glass of red wine and settled into his chair. He looked at me with cold calculation. He explained that funding my education offered zero return on investment. He said Beatrice had the charm and the grace to marry well and elevate the family status. My mother Susan nodded along, cutting her steak without even looking in my direction. She told me I should view this as an opportunity to build character. She suggested I take out a mountain of student loans and get a job at a diner. The air in the room felt thin. I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect me and realized they were just venture capitalists cutting a losing asset. I did not cry. Crying was a waste of hydration. I just picked up my fork and started calculating exactly how much freedom was going to cost me. The disparity became a living, breathing entity the day we moved out of our childhood home. Beatrice stood in the driveway holding the silver keys to a new sedan. The paint reflected the afternoon sun, and the leather seats carried a factory-fresh scent. My father handed her the registration with a wide grin, claiming a young professional needed reliable transportation to navigate the streets of Boston. He counted out crisp bills to pay the car transport driver who delivered it. Beatrice tossed her designer luggage into the trunk, complaining that the cargo space was slightly too narrow for her shoe collection. I stood on the porch steps, holding a single canvas duffel bag containing my thrifted clothes and a refurbished laptop I bought from a pawn shop. My parents did not offer to drive me to my campus. They claimed the 3-hour trip west would disrupt their afternoon schedule. I dragged my bag down the sidewalk to the transit stop while they took endless photographs of Beatrice posing against the hood of her new vehicle. I sat on a sticky wooden bus bench watching their brake lights disappear down the tree-lined avenue. The diesel exhaust fumes stung my eyes, but I refused to blink. I boarded the crowded bus and watched the familiar suburban streets fade into the distance, knowing I was leaving more than just a zip code. A week later, I settled into a cinder-block dormitory. The walls were painted a sterile hospital green, and the heating unit rattled constantly against the cold window. My roommate was a quiet girl who kept entirely to herself, leaving me to navigate the suffocating pressure of my rigorous biochemistry program alone. Beatrice, meanwhile, relocated to a high-rise apartment overlooking the harbor. She complained about the shade of the granite countertops during a brief phone call. My parents paid her security deposit, her first and last month's rent, and a premium monthly fee for a heated parking garage without a second thought. I sat on my thin, uncomfortable mattress reviewing a stack of student loan documents. The towering interest rates printed in fine, bold ink felt like a heavy iron chain waiting to be locked around my ankles. I called my mother Susan, hoping for a single shred of maternal guidance or reassurance. She answered the phone while packing a large suitcase. I could hear the distinct rustle of silk garments and tissue paper through the receiver. She told me applying for high-interest loans was a necessary rite of passage. She claimed financial hardship built character and would teach me the value of a dollar. She delivered this lecture while deciding between two pairs of Italian leather walking shoes. My parents needed their surplus cash to fund a 3-week vacation to Europe to celebrate their successful parenting. Beatrice was flying out of a private terminal to meet them in Paris for a shopping excursion. I listened to my mother snap her suitcase shut. The sharp metallic click was a loud, definitive period at the end of my childhood. I hung up the phone and signed the predatory loan papers in silence, pressing the pen so hard it almost tore the paper. I stopped waiting for a rescue ship that was never going to sail. I threw myself into the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of basic survival. My alarm clock buzzed every single morning at 4 o'clock in the pitch-black cold of the Massachusetts autumn. I pulled on my stiff work boots and walked 2 miles to a local commercial bakery before the neighborhood streetlights even turned off. The bakery was a warm, humid cave where I spent 3 exhausting hours hauling heavy canvas bags of raw flour. I lifted 50-pound sacks, pouring them into giant steel vats before scrubbing industrial mixing bowls until my knuckles bled. The bakery owner was a stern woman who paid minimum wage but allowed me to take home the burnt pastries that could not be sold. My hands grew raw, calloused, and perpetually dry from the constant washing. My hair and clothes absorbed the heavy, thick scent of rising yeast, melting sugar, and industrial floor bleach. By the time the sun finally peeked over the horizon, I was already physically spent. But I stripped off my flour-dusted apron and sprinted across the sprawling campus to my early morning organic chemistry lecture. I sat in the back row, taking meticulous, detailed notes, while my classmates nursed their weekend hangovers and sipped expensive iced coffees. The contrast between my 2 separate lives was sharp and unrelenting. In the bakery kitchen, I was cheap, expendable labor meant to be worn down and replaced. In the science laboratory, I was sharp-focused and deeply hungry for knowledge. I stared through high-powered microscopes at complex cellular structures, watching cell division happen in real time. I realized that adaptation was the only true mechanism for survival in any environment. Organisms that fail to adapt to harsh environments simply die out, leaving no trace behind. I chose to adapt. The physical toll became a relentless, dull ache in my joints and muscles. I fueled my tired body on leftover day-old bagels and jars of discount peanut butter I kept hidden under my dorm bed. I calculated every single penny I earned from the bakery, allocating strict, meager portions for biology textbooks, required lab fees, and a cheap pair of winter boots to survive the impending snowstorms. Beatrice posted daily glossy photographs of her European excursion on social media. She posed in front of historic cafes wearing silk scarves smelling of expensive French perfume, while I scrubbed thick burned caramel off a hot baking sheet smelling of harsh cleaning chemicals. Her daily routine was a carefully curated gallery of endless leisure and parental funding. My daily routine was a rigid spreadsheet of sheer survival, where one missed shift meant going hungry for a week. Yet a strange, powerful phenomenon occurred during those quiet, dark walks to the bakery each morning. The bitter resentment began to burn away, leaving behind a cold, clear, sharp focus. The deep exhaustion was a heavy, wet blanket draped over my aching shoulders, but I wore it proudly, like a suit of armor. Every meager paper paycheck I deposited into my sparse bank account was another solid brick in a thick, soundproof wall I was constructing between my future and their control. I realized my parents' financial abandonment was actually a bizarre, unintentional gift. By refusing to invest in my education, they legally and morally forfeited their right to direct my adult life. They could buy my older sister's blind compliance with European vacations and luxury cars, but my true independence was being forged in the intense heat of a commercial baking oven. The isolation was incredibly painful, but it was also pure and uncomplicated. I was building a magnificent fortress to protect my future, and I was doing it entirely alone. I was content to remain in the shadows, piling my bricks one by one. Or at least I thought I was alone until the brass bell above the bakery door chimed on a rainy Tuesday morning, introducing the only person who ever bothered to look closely at my foundation. My grandfather Theodore possessed the rare ability to see through thick layers of family pretense. He was an architect of his own reality, and a man who understood the fundamental difference between building wealth and performing wealth. Decades ago, he purchased empty dirt lots across the state and transformed them into a sprawling real estate portfolio containing commercial strip malls and residential complexes. Yet he drove a battered domestic pickup truck and lived in a single-story brick house with a fading shingle roof. He never bought into the flashy country club lifestyle my father desperately chased. Theodore wore faded flannel shirts and kept his fingernails trimmed short. His hands were perpetually rough from years of fixing his own plumbing and planting his own vegetable garden. He knew that money was a tool for security rather than a weapon for social climbing. That rainy Tuesday morning, he parked his rusted truck outside the bakery window. I wiped heavy condensation off the glass and saw him pull his jacket collar up against the cold drizzle. He walked through the front door and the brass bell signaled the arrival of a very different kind of customer. He did not walk up to the cash register or announce his presence to the staff. He bypassed the busy breakfast rush and settled into a cramped corner booth near the industrial ovens. He ordered a plain black coffee and unfolded a damp local newspaper. For 3 grueling hours, he sat in quiet observation. He watched me navigate the morning chaos with practiced efficiency. A man wearing an expensive tailored suit yelled at me because his heated pastry was too cold. I bit my tongue, apologized, and warmed it up while keeping a neutral expression. A teenage boy spilled a large iced latte across the pristine tile floor. I grabbed a heavy wet mop and scrubbed the sticky mess while managing a line of 10 impatient commuters. I lifted heavy steel trays of burning hot bread, rotating them through the display cases while my shoulder muscles screamed in protest. Theodore witnessed the entire degrading spectacle. He did not step in to defend me or offer to pay the angry man to leave. He just watched my face. He studied how I absorbed the daily humiliation and channeled it into pure momentum. He was measuring the structural integrity of my spine. The morning rush finally cleared out and my exhausting shift ended. I untied my stained apron and walked over to his corner booth. He pushed a fresh cup of steaming coffee across the wooden table toward me. It was hot and bitter, just the way I needed it. He did not offer a pity speech. He did not tell me I deserved better or apologize for my parents' behavior. Theodore operated on strict pragmatism and zero sentimentality. He looked at my raw, callous hands and asked a single pointed question. He asked what my long-term plan was. I sat across from him and laid out the cold, hard math. I explained that my biochemistry program required intense laboratory fees, expensive textbook costs, and eventual graduate school tuition. I told him the final calculated number was $250,000 to finish the entire academic track and graduate without a mountain of predatory debt. I explained that I was not relying on bakery wages alone to reach that peak. I was meticulously submitting applications for every large private grant and national fellowship available to science majors. I told him I treated grant writing like a second job, staying up late into the night perfecting essays and securing academic recommendations. Theodore listened to my strategy without interrupting or offering empty praise. He took a slow sip from his ceramic mug and studied the bustling street outside the wet window. He told me I had the right blueprint, but I needed to protect my construction site. He warned me that loud ambitions always attract scavengers. He advised me to keep my head down and my mouth shut. He said the most powerful moves a person can make are executed in total silence. He told me to let my parents believe I was struggling and let them think I was drowning in the bakery flour. If they knew I was building an escape route, they would try to claim the toll fare. He tapped his thick finger on the wooden table and smiled a knowing, subtle smile. He told me a game of chess is won long before the final piece is taken. I nodded and absorbed his wisdom, letting the hot coffee warm my exhausted bones. I did not know it at the time, but that rainy morning was the last time I would ever see my grandfather healthy. The winter months crept in, and the harsh freezing cold brought a sudden illness. The doctors diagnosed Theodore with a fast-moving pancreatic condition. His physical decline was rapid and unforgiving. I adjusted my rigid sleeping schedule to a mere 3 hours a night, so I could visit his hospital room between my early bakery shifts and my afternoon organic chemistry labs. I brought him lukewarm tea and read my textbook chapters aloud to him while he drifted in and out of a medicated sleep. My parents treated his hospital room like a waiting area for a lottery drawing. They visited sparingly, and when they did, they spent the entire time whispering in the sterile hallway. My father paced the linoleum floors, making quiet phone calls to financial advisors. My mother filed her nails and complained about the uncomfortable plastic waiting room chairs. They were already mentally spending a fortune that had not yet been inherited. They viewed his fading heartbeat as a ticking clock leading to their inevitable payday. Theodore passed away on a bleak Thursday morning. The funeral was a masterclass in theatrical grief. My mother purchased an expensive custom black dress specifically for the occasion. She stood by the graveside clutching a lace handkerchief and producing loud, dramatic sobs whenever an extended relative walked past. My father wore his best navy suit and shook hands with the attendees like a politician running for local office. Beatrice flew in from Boston wearing oversized designer sunglasses and complaining that the cemetery mud was ruining her imported leather heels. They performed the role of a devastated family with flawless execution. Yet beneath the fake tears and solemn handshakes, a thick, palpable greed radiated from them. They hurried the guests through the reception, viewing the required mourning period as a brief, frustrating hurdle. The day after we buried him, my father started pacing the living room, demanding the family lawyer expedite the legal proceedings. He spent hours drawing up blueprints for a luxury home addition and pricing out a second European vacation. He spoke openly about using the estate money to pay off the remaining balance on the expensive sedan he bought Beatrice. They treated my grandfather's legacy like a golden vault they were preparing to crack open. They believed they were standing at the finish line waiting to be crowned the victors. But Theodore was a man who planned his architectural designs years in advance. He saw the rot inside his son long before his illness took hold. My parents were eagerly sharpening their knives to carve up his empire. They had no idea my grandfather had already quietly moved all his pieces on the board, setting a trap they were about to walk right into. The law office of Mr. Davis sat on the 14th floor of a financial district building overlooking the gray Boston harbor. Rain beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city skyline. My parents walked into the reception, dressed for a victory lap. My father wore a custom-tailored suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase he intended to fill with stock certificates and property deeds. My mother sported a fresh blowout and tapped her manicured fingers against her designer handbag. Beatrice lagged behind them, scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone. They treated the solemn occasion like a lottery payout. I sat in a stiff wingback chair wearing my damp bakery shoes and a faded cardigan. I was just the required audience for their impending coronation. Mr. Davis ushered us into a boardroom that smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. He was a precise man with silver hair and a gray wool suit. He did not offer condolences or engage in hollow small talk. He simply took his seat at the head of the long wooden table and slid a single thin manila envelope across the polished surface. My father chuckled a low, confident sound, expecting a thick leather binder containing decades of real estate holdings. Mr. Davis adjusted his reading glasses and opened the single sheet of paper. His voice was a flat, steady monotone as he read Theodore Russell's final directives. He bequeathed the deed to his modest single-story brick house and a small cash sum to his son Thomas. The cash amounted to $50,000, which was barely enough to cover a year of my parents' country club dues. He left the contents of the house to my mother. He left a vintage silver necklace with a cloudy sapphire pendant to Beatrice. Mr. Davis stopped writing and folded the paper. The silence in the boardroom stretched so thin it threatened to snap. My father stared at the lawyer with a blank expression, waiting for the punchline. When Mr. Davis began to slide the documents back into the envelope, My father placed his hand flat on the table. He asked where the commercial portfolios were. He demanded to know the location of the strip mall deeds, the acreage, the high-yield investment accounts. Mr. Davis looked at him over the rim of his glasses. He stated in a clinical, detached tone that Theodore had liquidated his tangible assets and restructured his entire financial footprint into private corporate holdings 3 years prior. The estate my father was expecting to inherit simply did not exist anymore. It had vanished into a labyrinth of blind trusts and anonymous corporate entities. The transformation of my father's face was sudden and sharp. His skin flushed a deep mottled crimson and a thick vein pulsed erratically near his left temple. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger at Mr. Davis and accused the lawyer of criminal fraud. He shouted that Theodore was a senile old man who had been manipulated into hiding the family fortune. My mother gripped the edge of the table, hyperventilating as her vision of a second European vacation dissolved into dust. Beatrice dropped her phone, realizing the luxury condo she was just touring online was now permanently out of reach. Mr. Davis did not flinch. He pressed an intercom button and calmly asked his receptionist to prepare a copy of the legal restructuring timeline. He handed the thick stack of irrefutable proof to my father and politely asked us to vacate his premises. My parents did not return to their suburban home. They drove straight to Theodore's modest brick house like scavengers descending on a carcass. I followed them in a cheap rideshare car, needing to witness the final act of their delusion. When I stepped through the front door, the destruction had already begun. My father was tearing through a filing cabinet in the home office, throwing decades of tax returns and utility bills onto the carpet. My mother was emptying out coffee cans in the kitchen pantry, searching for rolled-up cash. Beatrice sat on the floral sofa inspecting the vintage sapphire necklace and complaining that the silver chain was tarnished. They ripped up floorboards in the bedroom closet and sliced open the underside of the mattress. They were looking for a secret map to a buried treasure that had already been shipped across the ocean. I stood in the hallway watching them unravel. Their greed had finally consumed their dignity. The house was reduced to a chaotic mess of scattered papers, broken drywall, and shattered expectations. I looked around the room and Theodore had left me nothing at all in the official will. My name was not mentioned on that single sheet of paper. There was no secret envelope slipped into my pocket. There was no hidden trust fund waiting for my signature. I walked out the front door empty-handed. I did not shed a single tear. I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. I was no longer waiting for a rescue. I was untethered and entirely responsible for my own survival. I hailed a bus back to my campus and left my parents digging through the literal dirt. My reality waiting for me back in my cinderblock apartment was harsh and unforgiving. The academic semester was entering its final brutal phase. I was balancing a schedule that broke the 80-hour mark every single week. I spent my mornings hauling flour sacks at the bakery, my afternoons running complex protein assays in the university laboratory, and my nights studying for advanced biochemistry finals until my vision blurred around the edges. I lived on a diet of stale bread, black coffee, and sheer stubborn willpower. My bank account was a single medical emergency away from total collapse. The student loan interest was accumulating faster than I could track. The pressure was a physical weight pressing against my chest every time I took a breath. Yet beneath the crushing exhaustion, I felt a strange, resilient peace. My parents were trapped in a prison of their own entitlement, but I was earning every single inch of my ground. My entire strategy hinged on one specific target. The Commonwealth Vanguard Scholarship was not a standard financial aid package. It was an apex predator in the world of academic grants. It was a private anonymous fund awarded to only one university student in the entire state of Massachusetts. The criteria were exceptionally rigid. The applicant needed a flawless academic record, a full-time employment history, and an essay detailing a clear vision for scientific innovation. The prize was staggering. $250,000 deposited directly into the winner's institutional account. It offered a full ride tuition coverage for undergraduate and graduate studies, plus a generous living stipend. It meant the instant erasure of all my suffocating debt. It meant quitting the bakery. It meant freedom. I had submitted my application packet 3 months prior. I poured every ounce of my midnight focus into that essay detailing my research on cellular adaptation in high-stress environments. It was a subject I understood on a deeply personal level. Now the waiting game had begun. Every afternoon I checked my cramped metal mailbox in the dormitory lobby. Every day I found nothing but junk mail and credit card offers. The silence from the Scholarship Foundation was deafening. My finals were approaching, and my bakery manager was threatening to cut my hours if I did not pick up extra weekend shifts. The walls were closing in again. I sat at my cheap folding desk, reviewing flashcards on metabolic pathways, while my hands shook from caffeine and fatigue. I knew my endurance had a biological limit. I was running a marathon without water, and the finish line was hidden behind a thick fog. Little did I know, the fog was about to lift and reveal a landscape that would change the trajectory of my bloodline forever. If you have ever worked twice as hard for half the respect, you know the specific kind of tired I was feeling during that bitter December. It is not the fatigue that goes away with a long nap. It is a deep cellular exhaustion that settles into your bone marrow. My joints felt like ground glass every time I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my dormitory. My fingers shook slightly when I tried to use a precision pipette in the chemistry lab. I was maintaining a flawless academic record, securing the highest test scores in my entire biochemistry cohort. Yet my bank account was constantly hovering in the single digits. I navigated the campus cafeteria by memorizing which cashiers would look the other way when I slipped an extra piece of fruit into my backpack. I was a top-tier academic performer living like a stray animal. Beatrice, meanwhile, was watching her curated life collapse under the weight of her own incompetence. The luxury Boston apartment and the new sedan did not magically grant her the discipline required to pass university-level courses. She dropped 2 foundational classes right before midterms to avoid immediate academic probation. She called our parents every weekend with a new dramatic crisis. I heard the details through my roommate, who occasionally saw Beatrice complaining on public social media feeds. Beatrice claimed her professors were prejudiced against her because she wore designer clothing. She insisted the ambient noise from the harbor traffic made it impossible to study her introductory communications textbooks. She demanded a higher monthly allowance to hire private tutors she never actually met. My parents responded to her academic failure by throwing good money after bad. The grand inheritance they expected from my grandfather had evaporated, leaving them with nothing but their suburban house and a modest cash sum. Instead of forcing their golden child to face reality, they doubled down on their losing investment. My father took out a second mortgage on the family home to cover Beatrice's escalating credit card debt. My mother discreetly sold her favorite diamond tennis bracelet to keep up appearances at their social club while funneling the cash directly to Boston. They were draining their own shrinking savings to keep a sinking ship afloat. They viewed her expensive struggles as a temporary setback for a future socialite. During this entire period of financial panic, they never once dialed my phone number. They never sent a text message to ask if I had enough money to turn on my apartment heating unit during the freezing winter nights. They did not know I was wrapping my feet in plastic grocery bags before putting on my boots to keep the melting snow from soaking my socks. I was a ghost to them. I was an afterthought, discarded and forgotten in the western part of the state. I preferred the silence. Every time my phone screen remained dark, I felt a strange sense of victory. Their neglect was the mortar holding my bricks together. I was surviving entirely outside their ecosystem. The turning point arrived on a Wednesday morning. So cold, the moisture in the air froze against the dormitory windows. I was returning from a brutal opening shift at the bakery. My coat was dusted with flour and my hands were numb. I walked into the dim lobby of my building and checked my small metal mailbox. Usually it held nothing but local supermarket flyers or threatening notices from the student loan office. This time the metal door creaked open to reveal a thick, heavy envelope resting in the dark compartment. It was made of high-quality cream parchment paper. It did not have a standard printed return address. The back of the envelope was sealed with dark red wax stamped with an intricate crest. It felt heavy in my numb hands like a piece of history pulled from a different era. I carried it up the 3 flights of stairs to my cinderblock room. The heating unit was broken again, leaving the air inside my apartment colder than the hallway. I did not take off my coat. I just sat on my broken futon sofa feeling the loose metal springs dig into my legs. I slid my thumb under the wax seal and broke it open. The letterhead bore the official crest of the Commonwealth Vanguard Scholarship Foundation. The text was printed in crisp black ink. I read the first sentence and my heart stopped beating for a full second. I was officially named the sole recipient of the statewide grant. I traced my dry fingers over the printed numbers. $250,000. The details were laid out in clear, undeniable terms. The foundation was providing a full ride covering all past and future undergraduate tuition. They were providing a generous living stipend to cover rent, food, and laboratory fees. They were erasing the predatory loans hanging over my head. They were funding my inevitable transition into graduate studies. I read the words until the black ink blurred into a gray smudge. I read the signature of the foundation administrator, confirming the funds were already secured in an institutional trust, waiting for my authorization. I did not scream. I did not jump up and down or call a friend. The reaction was far more profound than temporary excitement. My shoulders dropped 2 inches, as the invisible boulder I had been carrying for 3 years finally rolled off my back. I bent forward, resting my forehead against my knees, and cried quiet, steady tears. They were not tears of joy. They were tears of pure, profound relief. The brutal, invisible grind was finally over. I did not have to haul sacks of flour in the dark anymore. I did not have to steal apples from the cafeteria. I did not have to worry about the cold. I had won the hardest race of my life. I sat in the freezing room, letting the reality wash over me. The money was mine. The future was mine. But the true genius of the situation was a hidden architectural detail I would not understand until much later. The foundation required the university to publish a press release acknowledging the award. It was a standard transparency protocol for private grants. I signed the acceptance forms and mailed them back without a second thought. I believed the transaction was a simple exchange of merit for funding. I did not realize that publicizing a $250,000 windfall is like ringing a dinner bell in a forest full of starving wolves. My parents were drowning in the debt they created for Beatrice. They were desperate, hungry, and looking for a lifeline. The moment my name hit the university newswire, the trap my grandfather built was finally armed and ready to spring. The university required a mandatory profile update for all grant recipients. I filled out the digital forms on a Tuesday afternoon sitting in the quiet library. The financial aid office forwarded my information to the campus public relations department. They were hunting for an inspiring human interest angle to boost their seasonal newsletter. A campus photographer met me in the chemistry building, taking a few generic pictures of me adjusting a microscope. I thought the image would remain buried on the back page of a digital alumni pamphlet. I underestimated the slow news cycle of a Massachusetts winter. The local county newspaper picked up the university press release seeking filler content for their weekend edition. They printed my photograph alongside a bold headline announcing a local student securing a $250,000 private academic grant. The ink dried, and the newspaper landed on thousands of suburban driveways. I had unknowingly painted a bright red target on my own back. 3 days after the article circulated, my phone vibrated against the stainless steel surface of my laboratory workstation. I was recording the final measurements for a lipid extraction experiment. I glanced at the glowing screen and recognized the caller identification. It was my mother. The screen displayed a contact name I had not seen illuminate in over 6 months. The silence between us had been a peaceful, deliberate boundary. I wiped my gloved hands on a paper towel and answered the call, stepping out into the echoing linoleum hallway. Susan did not start the conversation with an apology for her absence. She led with a high-pitched artificial sweetness that made my stomach tighten. She asked about the winter weather and complimented my work ethic. She offered hollow praise for the scholarship victory, acting as though she had supported my academic journey from the very beginning. Her tone was the audible equivalent of a plastic flower. The pleasantries lasted exactly 2 minutes before the fragile facade cracked. Her voice dropped its manufactured warmth and shifted into a frantic, panicked cadence. Susan took a sharp breath and dropped the heavy anchor she had been carrying. She informed me that Beatrice was in serious trouble. The golden child had not merely stumbled academically, she had engineered a total structural collapse of her Boston lifestyle. Beatrice quietly dropped out of her luxury private college weeks ago, hiding the failure from everyone. Instead of attending classes, she spent her days wandering through high-end retail districts, swiping premium credit cards to maintain the illusion of success. She purchased designer handbags, expensive salon treatments, and imported cosmetics while her tuition bills went unpaid. The debt accumulated with terrifying speed, reaching six figures in a matter of months. Beatrice always viewed money as an infinite resource generated by simply existing. During our high school years, she routinely crashed her expensive vehicles and expected our father to replace the bumpers without a lecture. She treated retail workers with disdain and viewed consequences as something that only happened to the lower class. Susan nurtured this delusion. My mother often took Beatrice on weekend shopping sprees, rewarding her mediocre grades with expensive jewelry to ensure she looked presentable for wealthy social circles. They built a fragile ecosystem based entirely on appearances. Now the bill for years of superficial indulgence was finally due. My parents were not shielded from the fallout. Thomas and Susan had co-signed every single financial document Beatrice put in front of them, believing her eventual high society marriage would yield a return on their investment. The banks did not care about her potential. They only cared about the collection schedule. Susan explained that the creditors were seizing their assets. The bank issued a formal notice threatening to foreclose on our childhood home. The house with the crystal chandelier and the manicured lawn was about to be auctioned off to satisfy the retail debts of a dropout. My parents were drowning in a turbulent ocean they filled with their own poor decisions. The creditors were dismantling their carefully curated image brick by brick. Susan wept into the phone receiver, describing the humiliation of receiving a foreclosure notice in the mail. She complained about the neighbors watching the process servers walk up their driveway. Her tears were not born of regret or introspection. She was only crying because the public embarrassment was unbearable. I stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the science building hallway, listening to her unravel. I waited for her to ask for a small loan or beg for temporary assistance. Susan did not ask for help. She demanded a rescue operation. She told me the Vanguard scholarship money belonged to the family unit. She instructed me to contact the financial aid office immediately, withdraw the entire cash balance, and wire the funds directly to a specific bank account controlled by my father. She did not suggest a payment plan. She commanded a total surrender of my lifeline. Susan justified the extortion by claiming it was my biological duty to save them. She raised her voice, reminding me they provided a roof over my head during my childhood and gave me the gift of life. She stated that my academic success was a direct result of their strict parenting. Her twisted logic hung in the air between us. I listened to the desperate breathing on the other end of the line and experienced a profound moment of clarity. Susan truly believed she owned my brain. She viewed my intelligence and my endurance as resources she could harvest whenever her preferred daughter ran out of money. She did not see a biochemistry student who earned a prestigious grant through sleepless nights and bakery shifts. She saw an automated teller machine standing in a university hallway. She demanded the bricks I used to build my sanctuary so she could patch the holes in her sinking ship. I did not interrupt her monologue. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection, allowing her demands to ring hollow in my ears. I looked down at my worn sneakers and remembered the mornings I walked through the snow to the bakery because I could not afford a bus pass. I remembered the hunger pangs I ignored while memorizing protein structures in the library. My parents possessed the wealth to shield me from that pain, but chose to spend it on European vacations and silk dresses for my sister. Now the tables were inverted. The universe placed the power dynamic firmly in my calloused hands. Susan interpreted my silence as submission. She dictated the routing numbers for my father's checking account and told me to process the wire transfer before the weekend. She promised we would discuss my living arrangements after they secured their home. The audacity of her promise was a physical strike. She expected me to sacrifice my entire academic career, my safety, and my future to fix a leak she created. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the sterile laboratory air into my lungs. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults. I kept my tone flat and devoid of any measurable emotion. I told her I would think about it. Before she could launch into another frantic lecture about filial piety, I removed the phone from my ear and pressed the disconnect button. The screen went dark. I slid the device into my lab coat pocket and walked back into the laboratory. I knew the brief phone call was just the opening salvo. The hungry ghosts knew where I was and they were preparing to breach the walls. The digital silence following my mother's phone call lasted less than 48 hours before the true siege began. My cellular phone transformed into a weapon they wielded with relentless precision over the next 2 weeks. Susan failed to secure my immediate compliance, so she handed the offensive strategy over to my father. Thomas did not possess my mother's talent for artificial sweetness or passive manipulation. He operated through blunt force and unearned authority. His first voicemail arrived during my morning commute. I sat on the crowded city bus listening to his voice echo through my cheap plastic earbuds. He did not ask how I was doing or express any concern for my well-being. Launched straight into a loud, breathless tirade calling me an ungrateful, selfish brat who cared nothing about her own blood. His tone was heavy with righteous indignation, as if I had stolen the scholarship directly from his personal bank account. The voicemails accumulated day after day, filling my digital inbox with escalating threats. He promised to hire a vicious litigation attorney to drag my name through the local courts. He claimed he would sue me for the exact cost of raising me, billing me for every plate of food I consumed and every drop of hot water I used under his roof during my childhood. He wanted to retroactively charge me for the basic legal requirements of parenthood. I listened to his unhinged demands while walking across the frozen campus quad. The sheer absurdity of a grown man threatening to invoice his own daughter for tap water revealed the true depth of his financial panic. He was a cornered animal lashing out at the nearest available target. Beatrice joined the coordinated assault a few days later, choosing a more visual method of psychological warfare. My phone screen constantly illuminated with high-resolution photographs of official legal documents. She texted me pictures of bright pink eviction notices taped to her expensive mahogany front door. She sent images of final collection warnings from premium credit card companies. Beneath every photograph she typed long erratic paragraphs assigning the blame for her ruined life squarely onto my shoulders. She claimed my refusal to surrender the academic grant was an act of deliberate sabotage. In her distorted version of reality, I was the villain holding the rescue line while she drowned in a storm of her own making. She accused me of hoarding resources while my own sister faced the grim prospect of moving into a cheap suburban rental. They were sinking in a turbulent ocean. They filled with their own bad decisions, and they wanted to use me as a convenient raft. Let me tell you a fundamental truth about toxic family dynamics. They will turn their backs and ignore you for years, while you suffer in the dark building your own ship piece by piece. They will mock your calloused hands and dismiss your slow, steady progress. But the very second you finally set sail and hit open water, they will stand on the shore and demand you hand over the captain's chair. They expect to ride the wave of your success without ever touching a single piece of lumber. My parents and my sister expected to board my vessel and instantly demote me to the engine room. I did not reply to a single text message or return a single hostile phone call. I retreated into the sterile, quiet sanctuary of the university science building. I sat in my laboratory for hours running complex diagnostic tests and analyzing intricate protein structures under a high-powered electron microscope. The laboratory was a place defined by strict rules of logic and predictable outcomes. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic emotional extortion happening inside my vibrating phone. I placed my device face down on the black epoxy resin table and let it buzz against the hard surface while I focused on the cold, reliable math of my situation. I pulled out a fresh sheet of grid paper and began calculating the true cost of their historical favoritism. I tallied the estimated tuition for the luxury private college Beatrice attended. I added the security deposits and the monthly rent for her high-rise apartment overlooking the harbor. I factored in the sticker price of the silver sedan delivered to our driveway and the insurance premiums they covered. I included the designer wardrobes, the private European vacations, the expensive jewelry, and the fake tutoring sessions. The conservative estimate easily surpassed $300,000 over a remarkably short period. They poured a fortune into a leaking bucket. In the adjacent column, I calculated their financial investment in my own future. The total sum was a perfect, undeniable zero. They spent $250,000 on a daughter who rewarded them with 6 figures of retail debt and academic failure. Now they wanted to confiscate my hard-earned $250,000 lifeline to patch the holes in their terrible investment. They viewed my grinding poverty as a character-building exercise, but viewed Beatrice experiencing the consequences of her actions as a family emergency, requiring my immediate financial sacrifice. The math was simple, clear, and entirely devoid of any moral high ground on their part. Despite the clarity of my logic, a small, persistent seed of doubt began to take root in my mind. My father was a desperate man with a history of bending rules to suit his narrative. I worried he might actually find a predatory lawyer willing to file a frivolous lawsuit to freeze my institutional funds. I worried my parents could leverage some archaic familial statute to intercept the grant money directly through the university administration. The scholarship was my only ticket to survival, and I needed to ensure my fortress was impenetrable. I needed professional armor to shield my hard work from their grasping hands. I stripped off my white lab coat and walked out into the quiet, empty corridor of the science department. I pulled up the contact information for the Commonwealth Vanguard Scholarship Foundation. The listed administrator was Mr. Davis, the same meticulous silver-haired attorney who handled the reading of my grandfather's disappointing will. I dialed his direct office line, listening to the steady rings echo in my ear. His secretary answered and promptly transferred my call. Mr. Davis picked up the receiver with a crisp, professional greeting. The ambient sound of his office was calm and ordered, presenting a stark contrast to the frantic voicemails echoing in my head. I kept my voice steady and objective, removing any trace of fear or emotional distress. I explained the situation, detailing the escalating harassment campaign orchestrated by my parents and my sister. I described the specific threats of litigation and the demands for a direct wire transfer. I asked him a single crucial question. I asked if Thomas and Susan Russell possessed any legal mechanism or obscure familial right to access, intercept, or claim the funds awarded by the foundation. I needed to know if the walls of my ship were strong enough to withstand their impending legal siege. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several long seconds. I thought perhaps he was consulting a heavy legal tome or reviewing the fine print of my award contract. Then I heard a sound I never expected from the stoic, unsmiling lawyer. Mr. Davis laughed. It was not a booming, joyful noise. It was a dry, quiet chuckle that carried a distinct note of profound satisfaction. The sound sent a sudden, unexpected chill down my spine. It was the sound of a man watching a very old, very elaborate trap snap shut right on schedule. He stopped laughing and cleared his throat, returning to his measured, professional tone. He did not answer my question about their legal rights with a simple yes or no. Instead, he offered a much more intriguing solution. He told me to stop ignoring their phone calls. He instructed me to send my parents and my sister a brief formal invitation. He wanted me to invite them to his downtown law office on Friday morning. He stated it was finally time for a comprehensive family meeting to settle the financial dispute permanently. The calm certainty in his voice told me everything I needed to know. I was not walking into a negotiation. I was walking into an execution. I ended the phone call with the scholarship administrator and stood alone in the quiet science corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed a low, steady hum overhead. I pulled my cellular device from my pocket and opened the text messaging application. I needed to construct a message devoid of any emotion or hesitation. I typed a single precise sentence instructing my parents and my sister to meet me at the downtown law offices of Mr. Davis on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. I stated that we would settle the ongoing financial dispute once and for all during a formal meeting. I pressed send and watched the delivery notification appear on the screen. The response arrived less than 10 seconds later. My mother did not ask for clarification or express any gratitude for my cooperation. She replied with one single word: good. She assumed my concise message was a white flag of surrender. She believed the relentless campaign of threatening voicemails and staged eviction photographs had successfully broken my resolve. The days leading up to Friday moved at a strange, distorted pace. I continued attending my advanced biochemistry lectures and running my laboratory assays, but my mind was entirely focused on the impending boardroom collision. I did not study for my upcoming examinations. I spent my evenings mentally preparing for the intense psychological warfare my family was about to wage. Friday morning arrived with a dark, heavy sky and a relentless driving rain. The storm battered against my thin dormitory window, rattling the glass in its cheap metal frame. I bypassed my usual laboratory attire and pulled a charcoal gray suit out of my small closet. I bought the garments from a local thrift store a year ago for $15. The fabric was slightly stiff and the cut was not tailored, but it was clean and presented a rigid professional exterior. I tied my hair back into a tight, severe knot at the base of my neck. I was not dressing for a family reunion. I was dressing for a hostile corporate takeover. I took the early commuter train into the heart of the Boston financial district. The train cars smelled of damp wool and stale coffee. I watched the gray city blur past the rain-streaked window, feeling the rhythmic sway of the tracks beneath my feet. I walked the last 4 blocks from the transit station to the high-rise building, holding a cheap folding umbrella against the bitter wind. The icy rain soaked the lower half of my trousers and seeped into my worn shoes, but I barely registered the cold. I stepped into the sprawling marble lobby of the law firm and folded my dripping umbrella. The security guard checked my identification and directed me toward the polished steel elevators. I rode the car up to the 14th floor, watching the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher. My pulse remained remarkably slow and steady. The anxious knot that used to form in my stomach whenever my father raised his voice was entirely gone. The receptionist on the 14th floor expected my arrival. She offered me a sympathetic nod and pushed open the heavy double doors leading into the main conference room. The space smelled of rich leather, expensive wood polish, and fresh rain. A sprawling mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed ergonomic chairs. My family was already sitting along the left side of the table. They arrived early to establish dominance over the physical space. They looked incredibly smug and far too comfortable for people facing imminent financial ruin. My father Thomas sat in the center chair wearing a sharp navy suit. He had a thick leather folder resting on the table in front of him. My mother Susan sat to his right wearing a tailored beige dress and a string of pearls. Her posture was rigidly perfect, as if she were attending a charity luncheon rather than begging her youngest daughter for survival money. Beatrice sat on the far end of the row, staring at her phone screen. She was sipping an expensive vanilla latte through a green plastic straw. The sheer audacity of her beverage choice was staggering. She was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, facing eviction and actively destroying our parents' retirement plans, yet she still prioritized purchasing a $7 premium coffee on her way to extort my scholarship. She did not even look up when I walked into the room. My father checked his silver wristwatch and sighed heavily. He looked at me with cold appraisal, treating me like a subordinate employee, showing up late to a mandatory performance review. He did not ask how my train ride was or notice my soaked shoes. He just tapped his manicured fingers against his leather folder, signaling his impatience. My mother offered a tight, brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. She clasped her hands together and adopted a patronizing tone. She told me I was finally doing the right thing. She praised me for overcoming my selfish tendencies and remembering my duty to the people who raised me. Her voice echoed in the large room, sounding hollow and rehearsed. I did not return her smile. I pulled out a heavy chair on the opposite side of the mahogany table and sat down. I kept my posture straight and folded my hands, resting them on the cool wood. I did not bring any folders or bank statements. I did not need them. Mr. Davis sat quietly at the head of the table. He wore a crisp gray suit, and his silver hair was brushed back with exact precision. He had a thick legal binder resting near his right hand, but he remained silent, allowing my father to control the opening dialogue. Thomas cleared his throat and opened his leather folder. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a chief executive officer addressing a minor shareholder. He stated that the past few weeks had been incredibly stressful for the family unit, due to some unfortunate logistical errors regarding his oldest daughter's living arrangements. He refused to call her situation a failure or a crisis. He framed her massive retail debt and academic dropout status as a simple administrative oversight. Thomas pulled a crisp blue document from his folder and smoothed it flat on the table. It was an official wire transfer authorization form, printed directly from his personal banking institution. He pulled a heavy gold-plated pen from his suit pocket and began filling out the empty fields with practiced speed. He explained that he and my mother had spent the entire evening running the numbers. They calculated the exact amount of cash required to clear the mortgage arrears, satisfy the credit card collections, and secure a modest townhouse for Beatrice to live in while she found her footing. He wrote a long string of numbers on the blue paper and pushed it across the wide mahogany table toward me. He stated the final required sum was $200,000. He delivered the number without a single flinch or hint of shame. He was demanding 4/5 of my entire private grant. Before I could process the sheer magnitude of his entitlement, he offered a magnanimous concession. He told me he was graciously allowing me to keep the remaining $50,000. He waved his hand in the air, claiming that $50,000 was more than enough to cover a few science classes at a state university. He suggested I could always return to my bakery job if I needed extra spending money for textbooks. He framed the theft of my future as a generous compromise. He genuinely believed he was doing me a profound favor by managing my sudden windfall and leaving me with the scraps. He tossed the gold-plated pen across the polished wood. It rolled end over end, making a soft clicking sound, before coming to a complete stop, inches from my folded hands. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He instructed me to sign the bottom line so he could submit the paperwork before the banks closed for the weekend. Susan nodded in agreement, urging me to hurry up so they could all go to lunch. Beatrice took a loud, slurping sip from her iced latte, finally looking up from her phone screen to watch me sign my life away. I looked down at the blue form. The empty signature line mocked me. I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. I did not uncross my fingers. I did not reach for the pen or make any sudden movements. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the arrogant certainty in the room to reach its absolute peak. My father uncrossed his arms, his brow furrowing in slight irritation at my lack of immediate compliance. He opened his mouth to issue another sharp command. Before he could speak a single word, I shifted my gaze away from my family. I turned my head and looked directly at Mr. Davis sitting at the head of the table. I gave the silver-haired attorney a slow, deliberate nod, giving him the silent signal to drop the floor right out from under them. Before we get to the dismantling of their unearned entitlement, I want to pause and ask you a direct question. Put yourself in that stiff leather chair across from the people who abandoned you. What would you do in this specific room? Would you raise your voice and argue with them, demanding the apologies you are owed? Or would you sit in perfect silence and let the cold, hard facts do the talking? Tell me your strategy in the comments below. Mr. Davis did not rush. He operated on a timeline measured in billable hours and decades of legal experience. He slowly extended his right hand and picked up the blue bank transfer form my father had so confidently pushed across the mahogany surface. The silver-haired attorney held the document by the very edge, using his thumb and index finger, as if he were holding a piece of discarded trash found on the sidewalk. He spent a few seconds reviewing the routing numbers my father had written in bold black ink. Then he lowered his hand and let the paper flutter back onto the table. It drifted off center, landing near a crystal water pitcher. He looked directly at my father and stated in a calm, even tone that the document was useless. He explained that signing the blue paper would accomplish nothing because the funds in question were not subject to personal banking authorizations. Thomas did not handle the rejection with grace. His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck strained against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He puffed up his chest, attempting to physically dominate the space through sheer size and volume. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table. He declared that he was the patriarch of the Russell family, and he possessed every right to direct the finances of his own daughters. He launched into a brief aggressive speech about familial hierarchy. He claimed that since I was an unmarried student living under the umbrella of his lineage, my assets were an extension of his own wealth. He spoke about me as if I were a subsidiary corporation he had acquired rather than a human being sitting 3 feet away from him. He demanded Mr. Davis stop playing administrative games and process the signature so he could save his home from the impending bank foreclosure. Mr. Davis let the echo of my father's voice fade into the corners of the large room. He did not raise his own voice to compete. He simply folded his hands together, resting them on top of his thick legal binder. He delivered the first blow with surgical precision. He informed the room that the Commonwealth Vanguard Scholarship was a title designed for public consumption. It was a phantom name printed on university brochures to satisfy public relations requirements. He revealed that the grant was not a standard university financial aid package funded by alumni donations or state taxes. It was a private, irrevocable trust. The legal distinction hung in the air. Mr. Davis explained that standard grants occasionally allowed students to withdraw surplus funds for personal living expenses, putting cash directly into a checking account. A private, irrevocable trust operated under entirely different architecture. The trust retained sole ownership of the principal balance. It only disbursed payments directly to approved educational institutions and registered property management companies for student housing. I could not withdraw a lump sum of $200,000 even if I wanted to. I did not hold the keys to the vault. I was merely the designated beneficiary of its rigid scheduled payouts. Thomas blinked, staring at the lawyer in confusion. He shook his head, refusing to accept the logistical barrier. He argued that every trust has a board of directors, or a primary donor who can amend the rules. He demanded to know who funded the Commonwealth Vanguard account. He stated he would personally contact the donor, explain the severe family emergency, and request an emergency liquidation of the assets. He believed his skills as a suburban businessman could charm any philanthropist into handing over the cash. Mr. Davis removed his reading glasses and folded the earpieces together. He placed the glasses on top of the blue bank transfer form, pinning my father's useless numbers to the table. He looked Thomas squarely in the eye and delivered the second fatal blow. He stated that negotiating with the donor was impossible because the donor was deceased. He revealed that the anonymous benefactor who funded the private scholarship trust was none other than Theodore Russell. The room went dead silent. The sudden absence of sound was heavier than a physical weight. The ambient noise of the rain beating against the windows seemed to vanish entirely. Susan gasped, a sharp inhaling sound that rattled in her throat. Her fingers went slack and her heavy designer purse slipped from her lap, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Her pearl necklace clicked against her collarbone as she slumped back against the leather chair. Thomas lost all the color in his face. His confident flush drained away, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His mouth opened slightly, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single syllable. At the far end of the table, Beatrice finally reacted. She stopped pulling on her green plastic straw mid-sip. The expensive vanilla latte hovered near her lips as her eyes darted between the lawyer and our father. The shallow foundation of her curated world cracked open right in front of her. They all stared at the silver-haired attorney in profound shock. The truth descended on them, crushing the oxygen out of their lungs. The inheritance they had spent weeks searching for, tearing up floorboards and emptying filing cabinets, had never been stolen by a fraudulent lawyer. The real estate fortune had not disappeared into the void. It was sitting right here in this room, locked behind a wall of legal armor, and assigned to the one daughter they deemed a poor investment. I sat perfectly still on my side of the mahogany table. I did not smile or gloat. I kept my hands folded and my breathing steady while my mind raced backwards through time. The scattered pieces of my grandfather's intricate puzzle finally snapped together, forming a brilliant masterpiece. I remembered the rainy Tuesday morning at the bakery. I remembered Theodore sitting in the corner booth drinking bitter black coffee while he watched me scrub the tile floors. I remembered him asking for my exact financial calculation to finish my biochemistry degree. He did not hand me a check that day because he knew my parents would instantly confiscate it to fund my sister's vanity. He told me to keep my head down and work in silence. He spent the last few months of his life quietly liquidating his commercial properties and strip malls. He funneled the cash into a blind trust and disguised it as a statewide academic competition. He intentionally crafted the eligibility requirements to be so specific that only a biochemistry student working full-time with a flawless academic record could ever trigger the payout. He essentially built a custom vault designed to fit my exact dimensions. He bypassed his greedy son and his entitled oldest daughter, securing his legacy in the only person who shared his actual work ethic. My parents were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the deception. They realized they had spent the last 3 years ignoring the very person holding the keys to the family empire. Thomas stared at the mahogany wood, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. The initial shock was wearing off, and the raw humiliation was beginning to curdle into something much more volatile. He slowly curled his hands into tight fists, pressing his knuckles against the table. I watched his shoulders tense, recognizing the physical signs of an impending eruption. I was a man who believed the world owed him deference, and his own father had just reached from beyond the grave to publicly declare him a failure. The trap was sprung, but the wounded animal was about to thrash against the steel teeth. The silence shattered when my father slammed his closed fist against the mahogany table. The impact rattled the crystal water pitcher and sent a tremor through the polished wood. Thomas sprang from his chair, knocking it backward. He leaned over the table, pointing a shaking finger at the attorney. His voice echoed through the boardroom, stripped of its polished suburban veneer. He shouted that Theodore was his father, and the money belonged to his bloodline. He claimed the wealth was his birthright, built to be passed down from patriarch to patriarch. He viewed legacy as an automatic entitlement requiring zero maintenance and yielding infinite dividends. Thomas demanded Mr. Davis liquidate the trust immediately. He ordered the lawyer to dissolve the corporate entities, break the shielding trusts, and hand the money over as a traditional inheritance. He threatened to file injunctions and report the law firm to the state ethics board. He threw legal terms into the air, hoping they would act as magical spells to undo reality. He promised to tie the estate up in probate court for a decade if the funds were not wired to his account by the end of the business day. He was a man accustomed to bullying retail workers and intimidating local contractors. He assumed a high-rise attorney would fold under the same blustering tactics. Mr. Davis did not even blink. He did not raise his hands in defense or attempt to interrupt the tantrum. He waited until my father ran out of breath. The attorney reached for the thick black binder resting near his elbow. He unfastened the metal clasps and flipped open the heavy leather cover. The pages inside were filled with dense legal typography and blue notary stamps. Mr. Davis smoothed the first page and looked up at my father. His voice remained a calm, flat monotone, serving as a stark contrast to the shouting match my father tried to initiate. The lawyer explained that Theodore knew exactly what kind of man his son had become. Mr. Davis peeled back the curtain on my grandfather's final years, revealing a silent investigation we never noticed. Theodore used to attend Sunday dinners at our house, sitting quietly at the end of the table. He watched my parents pamper Beatrice. He saw them purchase a thoroughbred horse for her 16th birthday, an animal she rode twice before losing interest. During those same dinners, Theodore watched me staple the hem of my school uniform because my mother refused to buy me a new skirt. He observed the stark, unbridgeable gap in their parenting. Theodore recognized the rot taking root in his family tree, and he decided to prune the branches before the disease could spread. Mr. Davis turned a page in the binder. He detailed how Theodore took his entire liquid fortune and locked it into an ironclad blind trust months before his diagnosis. The architect of the family wealth designed a fortress to protect his legacy from his own son. He knew that leaving me a direct cash inheritance would be a fatal error. If I received a standard check, my parents would have relentlessly coerced me into handing it over. They would have used their parental authority and emotional manipulation to drain my accounts before I even graduated college. Theodore understood that a direct gift was vulnerable to extortion. To neutralize that threat, Theodore built a maze with only one exit. The trust was designed to award a merit-based scholarship rather than a traditional inheritance. Mr. Davis read the eligibility criteria aloud. The applicant had to be a female biochemistry student, enrolled in a Massachusetts university. The applicant was required to maintain a flawless grade point average while simultaneously holding documented full-time employment. The criteria were so hyper-specific, so finely tuned to my exact daily existence, that only one person in the entire state could ever qualify for the payout. My grandfather did not just give me his money, he made me earn it through grueling manual labor and sleep deprivation. He forced me to prove my endurance so nobody in this room could ever claim they handed me a free ride. The brilliance of the strategy settled over the boardroom. Theodore stripped away any accusation of nepotism or unearned privilege. I possessed the scholarship because I submitted the flawless transcripts and the bakery pay stubs to prove my eligibility. I passed the stress test he designed. He built an impenetrable legal fortress around my future, and he installed Mr. Davis as the primary guard dog. The attorney explained that the trust contained explicit defense clauses. Any attempt by Thomas or Susan Russell to contest the trust in court would trigger an automatic penalty permanently barring them from ever interacting with the foundation. My father stood frozen, leaning over the table, the anger drained out of his face replaced by a creeping hollow horror. He stared at the legal documents resting inside the black binder. The words on the paper were a final binding judgment from a father who found his son fundamentally lacking. Thomas built his entire identity around the assumption that he would eventually inherit the keys to the kingdom. He structured his reckless spending habits and his second mortgages on the belief that a massive safety net was waiting to catch him. Now he stared into the void. He realized his father had seen right through his country club facade. Theodore witnessed the financial abuse happening under his roof and responded by legally boxing Thomas out of the family fortune forever. There was no loophole, there was no appeal process. The money was gone securely locked behind a wall of academic requirements and trust parameters. Thomas slowly lowered his hand and sank back into his leather chair. The fight left his body. He looked like a deflated balloon resting against the high-backed seat. He spent his entire adult life trying to project an image of wealth and power. In a matter of minutes, an old man operating from beyond the grave stripped him of his illusions and left him with nothing but his own crushing debt. The power dynamic in the room shifted with the weight of a falling building. I sat across from my father and watched the realization break his spirit. I felt the calluses on my palms, reminding me of the countless hours I spent hauling flour and scrubbing floors to meet the very requirements my grandfather established. I earned my place at this table. My father only earned his eviction notices. The silence stretched out again, heavy with the finality of the legal decree. Thomas looked away from the binder, unable to meet my eyes or the steady gaze of the attorney. He was defeated. Yet the family panic was far from over. As my father retreated into his stunned silence, my mother realized the true gravity of their situation. The patriarch had failed to secure the rescue funds, and the immediate threat of losing her suburban castle loomed larger than ever. The reality of her impending poverty was about to break her carefully maintained composure. My father slumped back into his chair, stripped of his suburban armor. The realization of his defeat hung heavy in the chilly boardroom air. As his blustering anger evaporated, my mother finally grasped the true terror of their predicament. Susan spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless prosperity. She hosted charity luncheons and manicured her front lawn to rival a glossy magazine cover. She treated her social standing as a permanent fixture, believing her wealth was a birthright, immune to consequence. Now she stared at the black legal binder resting on the mahogany table, realizing the foundation of her world was built on sand, and the tide had just rushed in. The weeping started as a low tremor in her chest before tearing through her throat. These were not the calculated, theatrical sobs she produced at my grandfather's graveside. This was genuine, unfiltered panic. Her shoulders shook, and her carefully styled hair fell loose around her face, framing her wide, terrified eyes. She reached across the wide table, stretching her trembling hands toward me. The same woman who previously suggested I take on crippling loans and scrub diner floors to build character was now begging for her own survival. Her voice cracked as she painted a grim picture of their immediate future. She pleaded that the bank was finalizing the foreclosure process on our childhood home. She described how they would lose the property, the vehicles, and their pristine reputation. She pointed a shaking finger toward Beatrice, claiming her oldest daughter would end up living on the streets without my financial intervention. I shifted my gaze toward the end of the row. Beatrice sat frozen, holding her iced coffee with a white-knuckled grip. The golden child who spent her high school years mocking my faded thrift store jeans was suddenly facing the harsh reality of minimum wage existence. She possessed zero marketable skills and a staggering retail debt she could not service. She always treated cash as an infinite resource, generated by her mere presence in a room. She assumed I would simply hand over my lifeline because she felt inherently entitled to a comfortable life. Now the safety net was gone. I studied her panicked expression and the designer purse resting uselessly on her lap. Her curated reality was shattering into pieces right in front of her. In the past, their tears might have triggered a deep trauma response. A younger version of myself might have felt a desperate urge to fix their problems, hoping to finally earn a sliver of their affection. But sitting in that stiff leather chair, I felt nothing resembling pity. I felt no lingering anger or desire for vengeance. My chest was filled with a clean, empty quiet. It was the profound stillness of a survivor who had already mourned the loss of her family years ago. I grieved for them on the cold mornings I walked to the commercial bakery in the dark. I shed my tears over their neglect while eating stale bagels in a freezing dormitory. By the time they finally looked at me and asked for a rescue, the well was dry. I was looking at strangers. I turned my attention back to my father. Thomas was staring at his hands resting on the polished wood. I kept my voice steady and low, ensuring every precise syllable cut through my mother's sobbing. I asked him to think back to a specific evening a few years prior. I asked if he remembered sitting under the crystal chandelier in our dining room, holding a glass of expensive red wine. I asked if he remembered looking his teenage daughter in the eye and declaring she was not a financial priority. I recalled his exact phrasing, reminding him how he told me to figure it out myself because my future offered zero return on his investment. Thomas slowly raised his head. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. His jaw worked as if he were trying to form a defense, or perhaps an apology, but his vocal cords failed him. The room was thick with the weight of his past cruelty returning to collect its due. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He was trapped in a cage forged from his own arrogance. He had no leverage and no authority left to wield against me. I leaned slightly forward, letting the silence stretch for another agonizing moment before delivering my response. I told him I followed his instructions perfectly. I told him I figured it out. The quiet devastation in the room was palpable, but the architect of this trap had one final mechanism to deploy. Mr. Davis cleared his throat, drawing the attention of every person at the table. He adjusted his suit jacket and placed his hands flat on his legal binder. He stated that Susan and Thomas were operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the trust parameters. He explained that even if I suffered a sudden lapse in judgment and desired to help them, the legal framework prevented any such rescue operation. Mr. Davis outlined the poison pill, Theodore, embedded deep within the scholarship contract. The trust contained a strict diversion clause specifically naming Thomas and Susan Russell. The clause explicitly forbade the transfer, loan, or gifting of any trust funds to my parents or my sister. The attorney explained the exact mechanics of the severe penalty. If I attempted to write them a check, pay their mortgage arrears, or funnel a single penny into their bank accounts, the entire trust would automatically dissolve. My scholarship would be instantly revoked, and my tuition payments would cease without any possibility of an appeal. Susan stopped crying and stared at the lawyer in fresh horror. She asked what would happen to the $250,000 if the trust dissolved. Mr. Davis allowed a thin, grim smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He revealed the secondary beneficiary designated by Theodore. In the event of a breach, the remaining funds would be immediately liquidated and donated in full to a local charity dedicated to the rescue and rehabilitation of stray dogs. The sheer insulting brilliance of the contingency plan landed like a physical blow. Theodore Russell spent his life building a real estate empire, and he deliberately drafted a legal document proving he valued the welfare of abandoned street animals far above the financial comfort of his own son. He preferred buying premium kibble and funding veterinary care for stray dogs over paying off Beatrice and her credit card debt. It was the ultimate statement of disgust from a father to a son. The legal wall surrounding my future was 10 feet thick and lined with razor wire. Let me share an observation about toxic households. They always believe they are the exception to the rule. They think the damage they inflict can be erased the moment they decide they need a favor. They view forgiveness as a simple transaction where you pay the heavy price for their peace of mind. But true independence means you no longer have to participate in their skewed economy. My grandfather understood that money is the only language a people like my father truly comprehend. By removing the money, Theodore stripped them of their power and handed me the only shield capable of deflecting their endless greed. The rain outside the boardroom window picked up intensity, lashing against the glass in heavy driving sheets. The dim light cast long shadows across the mahogany table. My mother looked as if she had aged a decade in the span of 30 minutes. Her posture collapsed and her hands trembled on the armrests of her chair. Beatrice looked pale, her heavy makeup stark against her drained complexion. She was staring at her expensive boots, perhaps calculating how much she could sell them for on the second-hand market. Thomas remained silent, unable to process the magnitude of his father's rejection. Mr. Davis elaborated on the stringent monitoring systems in place to enforce the rule. He stated the foundation employed forensic accountants to audit my living stipend every single semester. They tracked my rent payments, my grocery expenditures, and my academic supply costs. They ensured the money was solely facilitating my biochemistry degree. There was no slush fund, no hidden cash account, and no exploitable loophole. If I bought my parents a tank of gas, the foundation would know. If I purchased Beatrice a bus ticket, the foundation would know. The guard dog never slept and its teeth were sharp. I listened to the lawyer detail the ironclad defenses and felt a deep surge of gratitude for the quiet old man who once parked his rusted truck outside the bakery. Theodore spent his final months ensuring I would never be forced to set myself on fire to keep my family warm. He anticipated their desperation, and he neutralized it long before they even knew they were in danger. I sat back in my chair, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of my own heart. The storm raging inside the boardroom could not touch me. I was safe inside the fortress he built, and I had no intention of ever lowering the drawbridge. The heavy silence following the revelation about the stray dogs proved too much for the golden child to bear. Beatrice gripped her plastic iced coffee cup so tight, the green plastic straw bent in half. She had spent her entire 23 years on this earth believing the universe operated on a simple transaction. If she cried or complained loudly enough, someone would eventually hand her a stack of cash to smooth over the inconvenience. Her parents had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars shielding her from the basic concept of a consequence. Now she was staring at an unmovable legal wall, and her brain simply short-circuited. Beatrice stood up so fast, her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. She slammed her hands onto the mahogany table and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She did not use legal arguments or try to negotiate a settlement. She reverted to the logic of a toddler fighting over a toy in a sandbox. She shrieked that the arrangement was incredibly unfair. She yelled that she was the oldest daughter and therefore she deserved the money by default. She claimed the scholarship belonged to her because she needed it to pay off her credit cards and maintain her lifestyle. She accused my grandfather of being a cruel old man who ruined her life on purpose. Her face turned a deep shade of red and the veins in her neck strained against her skin. When Mr. Davis ignored her screaming and kept his eyes on his legal binder, Beatrice lost the last remaining shred of her manufactured adult composure. She picked up her half-empty vanilla latte and hurled it across the room. The plastic cup spun through the air and smashed against the expensive textured wallpaper near the boardroom entrance. Ice cubes clattered across the polished floorboards. A thick brown stain of milk and espresso dripped down the pristine wall, soaking into the expensive baseboards. The lawyer did not flinch. Mr. Davis looked at the ruined wallpaper and sighed a slow, weary sigh of a man who had witnessed countless desperate people behave poorly. He did not raise his voice to scold her or demand an apology. He simply reached across his broad desk and pressed a silver button on his intercom console. He spoke into the small microphone with a calm, level tone, instructing his front desk assistant to send building security to the main conference room immediately. He added that the guests would require an escort to the ground floor due to property damage. I sat in my chair and watched my older sister completely unravel. This was the brilliant daughter my parents had bet their entire future on. This was the girl they deemed a superior investment. They sacrificed their retirement funds, their home equity, and my college tuition to fund her social ascension. The result of their tireless cultivation was a spoiled young woman throwing a tantrum in a corporate law office because her tears could no longer be exchanged for currency. She possessed zero coping skills and no emotional regulation. The moment the artificial floor was removed from beneath her feet, she revealed herself to be entirely hollow. She was a bad investment wrapped in expensive clothing. 2 large security guards entered the boardroom less than a minute later. They wore dark gray uniforms and carried an air of quiet authority that instantly changed the temperature of the room. They stepped around the puddle of spilled coffee and positioned themselves behind my parents' chairs. The arrival of the guards signaled the definitive end of the negotiation. My father realized he was out of moves. Thomas could not bully a seasoned attorney, and he certainly could not intimidate 2 broad-shouldered security professionals. He needed to reclaim a fraction of his lost power before he was thrown out of the building. Thomas stood up and grabbed his tailored wool coat from the back of his chair. He straightened his spine and attempted to project a sense of wounded dignity. He looked down his nose at me using the same cold, calculated expression he wore the day he told me to figure it out myself. He declared that my behavior was a permanent betrayal. He stated that taking the money and abandoning my own blood was an unforgivable sin. He puffed out his chest and told me I was dead to him. He announced that as of this exact moment, I was no longer a part of the Russell family. He expected me to break down. He expected the threat of permanent excommunication to crack my armor and force a tearful apology. He thought the label of family was a prize I was still desperate to earn. I placed my hands flat on the table and slowly stood up. I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not frown or look away. I allowed a genuine, relaxed smile to spread across my face. I nodded my head and thanked him. I told him he had finally given me the one thing I actually wanted from him. I thanked him for severing the tie and freeing me from the burden of ever having to pretend we were a real family again. His ultimate punishment was my ultimate liberation. His words did not cut me, they cut the chains holding me to his sinking ship. The blood drained from his face as my response landed. The hollow threat fell flat, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own failure. Susan let out a sharp sob, recognizing that Thomas had just burned the final imaginary bridge connecting them to my grandfather's wealth. She jumped up from her chair and tried to lunge across the table. She reached her shaking hands toward my arm, begging me to wait and listen to reason. She cried out my name, pleading with me not to do this to them. She never made contact. The security guard on her side of the table stepped forward and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, gently, but physically intercepting her path. The guard instructed the 3 of them to gather their belongings and proceed to the elevators. The physical barrier created by the security personnel perfectly matched the emotional barrier I had spent the last 3 years building. They were no longer allowed to touch me. They were no longer allowed to drain my energy. The guards guided my father, my mother, and my weeping sister out of the boardroom. Beatrice was still muttering about unfairness as she dragged her designer boots across the floor. Thomas kept his eyes trained straight ahead, refusing to look back at the empire he just lost. Susan was crying so hard she had to lean on the guard for balance. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the room in a quiet, peaceful isolation. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston streets. The storm outside had escalated. The wind was whipping the rain sideways, flooding the gutters and washing the pavement clean. I stood by the cold glass and looked down at the sidewalk 14 stories below. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the lobby pushed open. 3 small figures emerged onto the wet concrete. They did not have umbrellas. They did not have a private car waiting for them at the curb because they took the public transit into the city to save money on parking. I watched my father pull his wool coat over his head in a futile attempt to block the driving rain. I watched Beatrice ruin her imported leather shoes, stepping into a deep puddle near the crosswalk. I watched my mother shiver in her thin, tailored dress. They stood on the street corner, getting battered by the storm, waiting for a bus that would take them back to a house the bank was about to repossess. They had no shelter and no escape route. I watched them get drenched by the cold Massachusetts rain, and I felt a profound sense of closure. The ledger was permanently closed. If you are listening to this story, and you are currently trapped in a house where love is conditional, I want you to pay close attention. You do not have to earn your place in a family by setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. When people show you they only value you for the resources you can provide, you must believe them the very first time. Let them call you selfish. Let them tell you that you are dead to them. Take those insults and build a fortress with them. Sometimes the greatest gift a toxic parent can give you is their absence. Tell me your story in the comments below. See you in the next part. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling glass pane and let the heavy gray curtain fall back into place. The visual of my family shivering on the wet concrete faded from my immediate reality. I walked slowly across the thick woven carpet and took my seat at the mahogany conference table. The room was quiet again, but it was a different breed of silence. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet that preceded a confrontation. It was the vast, resonant stillness that follows a violent storm. The air felt lighter, and the harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer. Mr. Davis reached across his broad desk and picked up the crystal pitcher. The ice inside clinked a sharp, clear sound against the glass as he poured water into 2 heavy tumblers. He slid one of the tumblers across the polished wood toward me. He leaned back in his leather chair and removed his reading glasses, folding them neatly and placing them on top of his thick legal binder. The stern defensive posture he maintained while dismantling my father melted away. He looked exactly like a man who had just fulfilled a long-standing promise to a very old friend. He looked at me and his voice softened, dropping the clinical legal tone he used earlier. He told me Theodore was deeply proud of me. He explained that my grandfather did not just observe me working at the bakery that rainy morning. Theodore saw a mirror image of his own youth. My grandfather grew up during harsh economic times and built his initial real estate portfolio by laying bricks and repairing corroded plumbing with his bare hands. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated by people wearing expensive suits. When Theodore sat in that corner booth and watched me scrub flour off the bakery floor, he recognized the exact same raw, unyielding grit that built his empire. Mr. Davis took a slow sip of his water and continued revealing the true depth of the architectural blueprint. He told me Theodore understood the corrosive nature of unearned wealth. My grandfather watched his own son become lazy and entitled because the financial path was always cleared for him. Theodore refused to inflict that same curse on me. He wanted to forge my resilience in the fire of real hardship before handing me the keys to the vault. The scholarship trust was his elaborate method of ensuring I would never have to rely on people who did not value my existence. He gave me the gift of genuine independence. I wrapped my hands around the cold glass tumbler and drank the water. The cool liquid soothed my dry throat and I closed my eyes, letting the new reality wash over my tired mind. I was safe. The concept was so foreign, it felt like a strange new language I had to learn how to speak. The money was securely locked inside an institutional account, earning steady interest and paying my tuition directly to the university bursar. The mental spreadsheet I used to calculate my daily survival evaporated. I did not have to set my alarm clock for 4 in the morning anymore. I did not have to haul 50-pound sacks of raw flour or tolerate the verbal abuse of impatient bakery customers. I did not have to hide discount peanut butter under my dormitory bed or steal fruit from the campus cafeteria. I did not have to wrap my feet in plastic bags to keep the snow out of my worn shoes. The brutal invisible grind was over. I could finally just be a student. I could spend my mornings reading advanced biochemistry journals instead of bleaching industrial mixing bowls. I could focus entirely on genetic sequencing and cellular adaptation. For 3 long years, I had carried a jagged, heavy boulder on my shoulders. It dictated my posture, my sleep schedule, and my every waking thought. Sitting in that quiet Boston law office, I realized Grandpa Theodore had reached back from the grave and lifted the boulder right off my back. The physical relief was so intense it made my hands shake slightly. My nervous system was finally standing down from a state of perpetual high alert. I looked at the silver-haired attorney and offered my profound gratitude. I thanked Mr. Davis for his fierce protection and his flawless execution of the trust parameters. He smiled a genuine warm smile and waved off the praise. He told me he was simply following the blueprint drafted by a master architect. He advised me to go back to my campus and focus on my laboratory research. He promised to handle any future interference from my parents with swift legal prejudice. I stood up and grabbed my canvas duffel bag. It felt significantly lighter in my hands. I walked out of the mahogany boardroom and moved down the marble hallway. The heavy double doors closed behind me, severing the final thread tethering me to my toxic bloodline. I rode the steel elevator down to the ground floor, watching the digital numbers count backward. I stepped out of the high-rise building and walked into the bustling financial district. The rain had slowed to a light mist, and the gray clouds were beginning to fracture, revealing patches of pale blue sky. I took a deep breath of the damp city air and walked toward the transit station, a completely free woman. The train ride back to the western part of the state felt like a victory lap. I watched the passing landscape with clear eyes. When I arrived at my campus, I did not go straight to my dormitory. I walked directly to the commercial bakery. The afternoon shift was in full swing, and the smell of melting sugar hung heavy in the air. I found the stern bakery owner in the back office counting the register receipts. I handed her my stained apron and told her I was resigning effective immediately. She looked surprised, but I did not offer any detailed explanations or apologies. I simply walked out the back door, leaving the scent of yeast and bleach behind me forever. I returned to my cinder-block apartment and sat on my broken futon. The green walls and the rattling heating unit did not feel like a prison anymore. They felt like a temporary waiting room for a much brighter future. But true freedom often creates an unexpected vacuum. The silence in my room was deafening. I had spent so much energy surviving the covert war against my family that I forgot how to exist in peacetime. The sudden influx of wealth and academic security shifted my position on the board. I was no longer an invisible, exhausted girl hiding in the back row of organic chemistry. The university press release had circulated widely, and my name was now attached to the most prestigious private grant in the state. The professors who previously ignored my raised hand were suddenly eager to invite me into their exclusive research laboratories. The wealthy peers who overlooked my thrift store clothing now watched my every move with calculating eyes. The financial threat from my parents was neutralized, but the academic arena was preparing to test my endurance in a completely different way. I traded the hungry ghosts of my past for the sharp teeth of institutional ambition. My peers assumed my sudden fortune meant I was a soft target willing to share credit on research papers to buy their friendship. The academic wolves were already circling the perimeter, and they were about to learn that the girl who survived the Russell family was not afraid of a few jealous science majors. The aftermath of the boardroom meeting moved with a swift and merciless current. Without my grandfather's wealth to act as a financial buffer, my parents were forced to carry the full crushing weight of their own choices. The bank did not care about their country club reputation or the manicured state of their front lawn. The foreclosure process in Massachusetts operates on strict legal timelines, and the collection agencies showed them zero leniency. Exactly 1 month after our downtown collision, an email from Beatrice arrived in my student inbox. I was sitting in the library reviewing a dense peer-reviewed journal on molecular biology when her name appeared on my glowing screen. I did not feel a spike of anxiety or the familiar knot of dread in my stomach. I opened the message and read her frantic, unformatted paragraphs with detached clinical observation. She described a rapid, brutal descent into a reality she used to mock. The bank had officially locked them out of the suburban house. They were forced to sell their remaining vehicles and auction off the dining room furniture just to secure a security deposit for a tiny 2-bedroom rental on the far industrial outskirts of the city. Beatrice was currently sleeping on a cheap air mattress in a cramped room she shared with boxes of my mother's unsold designer clothing. The most revealing detail of her email centered on her new daily routine. The golden child who once claimed harbor traffic noise disrupted her academic focus was now required to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day. She was forced to secure a job as a cashier at a discount grocery store just to make the minimum monthly payments on her towering credit card debt. She filled the digital page with endless complaints about her new existence. She typed long sentences, whining about how much her feet hurt from standing on hard linoleum floors. She complained that her store manager was strict and reprimanded her for checking her cellular phone during the busy afternoon shifts. She wore a scratchy polyester uniform and spent her days scanning barcodes for customers she used to look down upon. She ended the email with a thinly veiled plea for a small loan, claiming she needed better shoes to endure the grueling checkout lane. She still believed a rescue operation was possible if she just painted a pathetic enough picture. I read the final sentence, and I did not write a single word in response. I moved my cursor over the trash icon and deleted the message. I did not block her email address or engage in a lengthy digital argument. I simply let the electronic file vanish into the archive. They were finally experiencing the exact life they thought I deserved, and I felt no obligation to interrupt their lesson. I did not search for their names on social media platforms or ask extended relatives for updates on their living situation. I let them fade into the background noise of a past I no longer inhabited. Hating them, holding on to the resentment, or plotting further revenge would require a significant expenditure of mental calories. I needed every ounce of my cognitive energy for my own upward trajectory. I traded the chaotic drama of my family for the sterile, predictable hum of the university science wing. I immersed myself in the laboratory, dedicating my days to complex genetic sequencing projects. The physical environment of the science building became my true home. I spent my afternoons calibrating thermal cyclers and isolating fragile deoxyribonucleic acid strands. I traded the smell of bakery yeast for the sharp scent of ethanol and agar plates. My hands lost their rough calluses and my posture straightened. The academic arena recognized my singular focus and rewarded it. The Vanguard Scholarship granted me access to resources I previously only read about in textbooks. The shift in my institutional status was subtle at first, but soon became undeniable. My professors stopped treating me like a passive undergraduate student sitting in the back row. They started inviting me to closed faculty seminars and seeking my input on intricate cellular adaptation theories. I sat at heavy oak tables in the faculty lounge drinking coffee with established researchers who viewed me as a peer. I was thriving in the exact high-level intellectual environment my parents told me I would never be able to reach. My father claimed I offered zero return on investment, yet the most prestigious academic minds in the state were actively bidding for my time and my analytical skills. I felt secure in my new ecosystem, believing the laboratory was a pure meritocracy where hard work yielded transparent results. I assumed the predators were all locked outside the campus gates. I failed to recognize that academia has its own distinct hierarchy of hungry ghosts. They do not wear tailored suits and threaten you with eviction notices. They wear pristine white lab coats and threaten you with intellectual obscurity. The transition from safety back into danger began during the middle of the spring semester. Dr. Eris Thorne was the head of the genetics department and a prominent figure in the national scientific community. She ran the largest research wing on the campus, securing millions of dollars in federal grants through her polished charm and ruthless publication schedule. She took a sudden intense interest in my cellular adaptation project. She invited me into her private office, a sprawling room lined with prestigious awards and framed medical journal covers. Dr. Thorne poured me a cup of premium tea and spoke to me with a warm, collaborative tone. She praised my recent datasets and complimented my precise methodology. She made me feel seen and valued in a way that mimicked genuine mentorship. She suggested we merge my independent research with her larger ongoing departmental study. She painted a vivid picture of a joint publication featuring both of our names yielding guaranteed exposure in top-tier scientific magazines. It sounded like a dream scenario for a young student. I spent 2 weeks working late into the night integrating my genetic models into her overarching framework. I trusted her authority and believed we were building something significant together. The illusion held firm until a quiet Friday afternoon when she called me back into her office to review the final grant proposal she intended to submit to the National Science Board. She slid a thick stack of printed pages across her desk. I picked up the document and scanned the executive summary. My eyes drifted down to the primary investigator attributions and the funding allocations. My heart executed a slow, heavy drop. Dr. Thorne had meticulously rewritten the narrative of the project. She framed my core cellular theories as her own original hypotheses. She listed herself as the sole primary investigator claiming total ownership of the intellectual property. My name was buried in the fine print, relegated to a minor laboratory assistant role. More importantly, she explicitly leveraged my status as a vanguard scholar in the financial section, using my private grant as proof of institutional matching funds to secure a massive federal payout for her own department. She was using my personal financial shield as a bargaining chip to enrich her own laboratory budget. I looked up from the document and met her gaze. Dr. Thorne smiled a calm professional smile. She did not look guilty or apologetic. She did not raise her voice or use aggressive language. She looked exactly like my mother did when she demanded I hand over the scholarship money to save the family house. She expected me to nod silently and accept the diminished role because she held the keys to the academic kingdom. She assumed my gratitude for her attention would blind me to the theft of my labor. The venue had changed, but the fundamental dynamic remained exactly the same. I traded a toxic family for an exploitative institution. I sat in the leather chair holding the stolen proposal, realizing the wolves were not gone. They had just learned how to disguise themselves as mentors. I placed the document back onto her desk and calculated the exact cost of my next move. I sat in the leather chair holding the stolen proposal, realizing the predators had just learned how to wear white lab coats. Dr. Thorne smiled her warm professional smile, expecting my silent compliance. She assumed my gratitude for her mentorship would blind me to the theft of my intellectual property. She calculated that an undergraduate student would never dare to challenge the head of the genetics department. She forgot that I survived the Russell family, and I knew exactly how to dismantle an extortion attempt. I did not raise my voice or accuse her of plagiarism. I matched her calm demeanor and placed the printed document back on her desk. I told her I needed the weekend to review the final draft and confirm the data tables before signing any disclosures. She nodded, assuming she had secured my submission and my silence. I walked straight out of the science building, breathing the crisp winter air, and dialed the direct line for Mr. Davis. The Vanguard Trust was a private fortress, and it possessed strict legal clauses regarding the allocation and attachment of its funds. I explained the situation to the attorney, detailing how the department head was attempting to siphon the prestige of the grant to line her own laboratory pockets. Mr. Davis audited the federal grant application details and discovered her blatant attempt to leverage my personal financial shield as institutional matching funds without proper foundation authorization. By Monday morning, Dr. Thorne received a formal cease and desist notice from the corporate legal team representing my grandfather's trust. The notice legally restricted my scholarship money from being attached to her departmental budget in any capacity and threatened immediate litigation if my intellectual property was submitted under her name. Without the required matching funds, her sprawling federal grant application instantly collapsed. She lost her lucrative research funding because she tried to steal credit from the wrong student. I quietly transferred my research portfolio to a different faculty member who valued academic integrity over ruthless ambition. The swift and decisive legal action sent a quiet ripple through the science department. The academic wolves learned to leave me alone, and the path forward was finally clear of obstacles. 3 years passed in a rapid blur of thick textbooks and humming laboratory equipment. I built a new ecosystem, defined by strict boundaries and relentless focus. The changing seasons outside the laboratory windows marked the steady passage of time. I watched the autumn leaves fall and the winter snow drift against the glass while I isolated proteins and mapped genetic markers. The days melted into long nights of analyzing complex genetic sequences and documenting cellular mutations. I poured my energy into the work instead of wasting it on the ghosts of my past. There were no frantic phone calls demanding ransom money and no staged eviction photographs to interrupt my studying. The silence was the greatest luxury Theodore ever bought for me. I maintained a flawless grade point average and secured my position at the very top of my biochemistry class. The girl who used to haul heavy sacks of flour in the dark transformed into a published researcher before even wearing a graduation cap. May arrived painting the Massachusetts campus in bright shades of green and gold. The air smelled of cut grass and blooming flowers. I stood in the holding area behind the auditorium stage, wearing a flowing black gown and a stiff square cap. The fabric felt heavy and significant, wrapping around my shoulders like a mantle of victory. The ambient noise of the restless crowd buzzed through the heavy velvet curtains. The university president took the podium and began reading the names of the graduating class. When he called my name, the sound echoed across the sprawling venue. I walked across the polished wooden stage to accept a diploma that belonged entirely to me and the ghost of my grandfather. The leather-bound folder felt solid and real in my hands. I paused near the podium and looked out into the sea of folding chairs. Thousands of proud families were cheering, holding colorful bouquets and aiming expensive cameras at the stage. I scanned the front rows, searching the faces of the celebrating crowds. My parents were not there. I did not mail them an invitation, and there were no empty seats reserved for them to fill. There was no theatrical reconciliation, and no sudden epiphany from my father. They remained exactly where I left them, shivering on a wet sidewalk of their own making. I did not feel a pang of sadness or a lingering wish for their presence. Their absence was a confirmed victory. The only person sitting in my designated cheering section was Mr. Davis. He wore a sharp gray suit and sat with perfect posture among the weeping parents. When I held up my diploma, he did not cheer loudly, but he tipped his hat to me and offered a slow, respectful nod. It was the only validation I needed to confirm my survival. After the ceremony concluded, the graduates spilled out onto the manicured lawns, tossing their caps into the warm spring air. Families embraced and posed for endless photographs under the clear blue sky. I bypassed the chaotic crowds and found Mr. Davis standing near a large oak tree, casting a cool shadow over the grass. He shook my hand, offering his formal congratulations. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed around the edges, holding the unmistakable scent of an old safety deposit box. He explained that Theodore gave him strict instructions to deliver this final piece of correspondence on the exact day I earned my university degree. I broke the brittle wax seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper, listening to the dry rustle of the ancient parchment. The handwriting was sharp and slanted, capturing the precise energy of the man who wrote it years ago. The message contained a single profound sentence. He wrote that a strong house cannot be built on a rotten foundation, and he was glad I found my own bricks. I read the words twice, feeling a sudden tightness in my throat. The sentiment validated every single cold morning I spent working in that bakery. It validated the isolation, the hunger, and the endless hours of studying. I folded the letter and placed it carefully into my pocket. I knew I possessed a lucrative job offer from a prominent pharmaceutical company starting the following week. The position offered a generous salary and full control over my own research initiatives. My future was bright and entirely my own, because the cycle of favoritism and financial abuse was broken forever. I shook the hand of the silver-haired attorney one last time, thanking him for being the guardian of my independence. I walked out of the shaded campus quad into the warm Massachusetts sun. I felt unburdened and ready for the life I had built. I walked toward the parking lot to drive away from the university for the last time. The air felt clear and the horizon looked endless. But the universe has a strange sense of humor, and the past rarely stays buried without a final struggle. As I approached my vehicle, I noticed a familiar figure leaning against the driver's side door, waiting in the quiet parking lot. The tailored clothes were gone, replaced by worn fabric and a hunched, defeated posture. The hungry ghosts were still searching for a way into my fortress, and they had just knocked on the front door of my new life. The figure leaning against the driver's side door of my vehicle slowly turned to face me as my footsteps echoed across the warm asphalt. The late afternoon sun illuminated her features, revealing the catastrophic toll of the last 3 years. It was Beatrice. The golden child who once treated the world as her personal luxury catalog was completely unrecognizable. Her designer highlights had grown out into dull, uneven roots. She wore a faded polyester jacket over a stained cotton shirt, and her posture was slumped with an unfamiliar heavy exhaustion. She looked 10 years older than her actual age, carrying the distinct weathered appearance of someone who recently discovered that survival requires actual effort. I stopped a few feet away from the front bumper of my car, keeping a safe measured distance between us. I did not drop my canvas duffel bag or reach for my keys. I just stood in my graduation gown and studied the shattered remnants of my older sister. Beatrice did not offer a congratulatory greeting or acknowledge the leather-bound diploma resting in my hand. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless monologue completely devoid of any pride. She explained that she took a 3-hour public bus ride from the industrial outskirts of Boston to track me down. She scoured the university commencement schedule online to pinpoint my exact location because she had run out of wealthy friends to exploit. Beatrice revealed the final pathetic chapter of our family collapse. She told me our parents had officially filed for total bankruptcy protection. The crushing retail debt and the secondary mortgages completely wiped out their remaining assets. The stress of poverty fractured their curated marriage, and they turned their bitter resentment directly onto her. Thomas and Susan finally realized their golden investment was a total failure. They blamed Beatrice for destroying their comfortable suburban retirement. They formally evicted her from their cramped 2-bedroom rental, refusing to subsidize her existence for another single day. She was entirely homeless, possessing nothing but the cheap canvas backpack resting near her worn shoes. She stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, expecting the familiar dynamic of our childhood to suddenly reactivate. She knew I had secured a highly lucrative position at a massive pharmaceutical company. She admitted she stalked my professional networking profiles online and saw the official hiring announcements. Beatrice demanded that I unlock the passenger door and let her move into my new apartment. She claimed we were sisters and blood relatives needed to stick together during times of severe crisis. She promised she would clean my kitchen and run my errands if I just gave her a warm bed and a weekly allowance. She was searching for a brand new host to attach her parasitic roots to, and she calculated that my newfound wealth made me the perfect target. I listened to her pathetic pitch and felt a profound sense of closure. She still believed my resources belonged to her. She thought my money was a communal fountain she could drink from whenever she felt thirsty. I slowly unzipped the top compartment of my canvas duffel bag. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy folded canvas apron I wore during my morning shifts at the commercial bakery. I had kept the garment as a tangible reminder of the foundation I built. The thick fabric still carried faint permanent stains of industrial bleach and burnt caramel. I walked forward and held the apron out toward her, offering it as my only concession. I told Beatrice that true independence cost exactly 4 hours of sleep and 80 hours of manual labor every single week. I informed her that the local bakery was currently hiring employees willing to scrub sticky tile floors in the pitch-black cold of the early morning. I offered her the exact same starting line I was forced to use. Beatrice stared at the stained fabric as if I were handing her a toxic chemical. She recoiled, physically pulling her hands back against her chest. She scoffed and told me she was not cut out for degrading manual labor. She claimed her fragile physical constitution could not handle that kind of environment. She refused to take the apron. She wanted the penthouse view without ever climbing the stairs. I let the heavy canvas garment fall from my hand. It hit the warm asphalt with a soft thud, landing directly between her worn shoes. I pulled my electronic key fob from my pocket and unlocked my vehicle. The headlights flashed a bright yellow sequence, breaking the tension in the parking lot. I opened the driver's side door and told Beatrice that she was not my responsibility. I reminded her that our parents spent $300,000 preparing her for the real world while I prepared myself. I told her the bank was officially closed and she was trespassing on my property. Beatrice began to cry, her face twisting into a mask of pure defeated rage. She called me a monster. She yelled that I was a cold, heartless machine, completely devoid of any human empathy. I sat down in the driver's seat and placed my diploma on the passenger side cushion. I looked up at her through the open door and delivered my final response. I told her I was not a monster. I told her I was just a terrible investment making my first highly profitable return. I pulled the heavy door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet leather interior of my car. I started the engine and reversed out of the parking space, leaving my older sister standing alone next to a discarded bakery apron. I drove away from the university campus, watching her figure shrink in my rearview mirror until she completely disappeared. I merged onto the interstate highway, heading east toward my new life. The late afternoon sun warmed the dashboard, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement sounded like a victory march. The heavy armor I wore for the past 4 years finally dissolved. The war was officially over, and I was the sole remaining victor. If you are watching this and dealing with people who drain your spirit, I want you to listen closely, because you do not owe your success to the people who refuse to help you build it. You do not have to negotiate with individuals who only acknowledge your existence when they need a life raft. Blood does not entitle anyone to the fruits of your labor, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away and let the consequences of their actions catch up with them. Toxicity relies on your guilt to survive. Manipulative families construct elaborate invisible ledgers, forcing you to pay off emotional debts you never actually incurred. They teach you that setting boundaries is a form of betrayal. They are lying to you. I spent years thinking I had to prove my worth to my parents. I thought if I just earned perfect grades and worked hard enough, they would finally look at me with the same adoration they gave my sister. I exhausted myself trying to solve a mathematical equation that was rigged from the very beginning. I realized the only person I needed to prove anything to was myself. Grandpa Theodore knew that fundamental truth. He watched me struggle in the dark, and he did not intervene to make my life artificially easy. He did not just give me wealth, but gave me the ultimate validation that my silent hard work was actually seen. He taught me that resilience is the only currency that never depreciates. I live in a beautiful house now, surrounded by tall oak trees in a quiet Massachusetts neighborhood. I do not have a crystal chandelier in my dining room, but I have a kitchen filled with warmth and laughter. I have friends who choose me for my character, rather than my bank account, and a career I deeply love. I spend my days directing genetic research at a top-tier pharmaceutical laboratory, dictating my own schedule, and securing my own intellectual property. I broke the ledger and threw it away, and you can do the very same thing. You hold the pen that writes the final chapter of your story. Thank you for staying until the end, and if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me what part resonated with you, and I will see you in the next story.